Hello again, and welcome to the program. I am Suren. I would like to talk to you about thought and language. As you know, the language is primarily for speaking, and it is not a written expression. The invention of writing and further developments from it, like for instance publishing or printing, proved to be one of the greatest achievements of the human society, and it occupies larger place in our days. When we read them, either in books or learn about them on social media. Therefore, we may be thinking in terms of the language being the printed word. However, printing and writing are substitutes for speech. What language, as a term in itself implies, too, is oral. How did it start originally? This is still unknown. There are many theories written about this matter, but one thing seems most certain, that it was connected with the development of the power of thought. Thought must have come first, for without thought, which needed expression, there could have been no use for language. But when language had come into being, it had a very powerful influence for further development of thought. This way, the border between mind and mind was broken down. People could therefore communicate their thoughts and experiences to the other in here. Man could only know nature and the world about him as it appeared. How it appeared to his neighbor, he would never know. However, by the sheer existence of language, he came to realize that in many things, what was true for him was also true for his neighbor. I believe this marked the beginnings of a rational life for men. To the extent we think in words and how far our thought is translated into words, it is difficult to determine, but it probably is correct to say that intricate thinking, for at least the majority of people, would be impossible without language. It could not function without such a means of expression. The language is also important as an instrument of communication and recording. In this capacity, language can be employed to at least 4 different purposes. 1. To communicate a fact. E.g., sky is blue, roses are red, snow is white. I will be going to Amsterdam, followed by London. Christmas Day is on a Friday this year. Sentences we use like these make a statement of a fact, although they give us no indication of any emotion of the speaker about the thing referred to. Had he said, "How red the roses are," we should have been entitled to read into the exclamation a certain amount of surprise and pleasure. But as it is, there is nothing in this statement to suggest that the rose awakens any response in him. He is recording or communicating an observed fact. 2. To express a feeling, an attitude of the speaker or the writer towards his subject. As can be seen, when we say rose is red, we express no particular feeling about the rose. Whereas if we see how red the rose is, we are. This is the second purpose for which language is used. And a very important one for the occasions in which we make statements and their effects are relatively few. If we would say, he took up a firm attitude on the question, it may seem at first sight that this is a mere statement of a fact, but actually the particular choice of words expresses an attitude of mind towards the action. Firm suggests approval. If we had disapproved, we should have called it obstinate. Some words express certain mental attitudes. And here we want more come up against the question of colored terms. Another difficulty, as we have seen before, is that in some cases, the same terms have different meanings or associations for different people. If I would describe someone as a most conscientious person, intending the description as a compliment, but to someone else, such a description may suggest a person who is overly nice and slightly priggish. The meaning we attach to words, especially those which are intended to appeal to the imagination or the feelings, depends very much largely upon our experiences. Reading from Keats' Ode to Autumn. Or, by a cider press, with a patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. To the other person, they have suggested nothing but the slow dripping of the juice from the press. But to the writer, who lived in a side country and had often seen cider being made, they brought back the very first and foremost the overpowering smell. Perhaps for Keats himself they meant something different from either. 3. To affect the listener or reader so that he is led to adopt some attitude or to accordingly accept views which the speaker desires him to. In here, the language is employed as an instrument of persuasion. The appeal may be to the reason, or it may be to the feelings. Which method is adopted will depend on a number of factors, but for the moment, this fact is not material. The motive is the same in either case. This function of language has become increasingly apparent and finds its most marked expression in propaganda. But it is not confined to this. From the child trying to wheedle a penny out of its father, to the preacher or the novelist with a purpose, all are using language in this way. 4. To describe the speaker's or writer's experiences, either physical or subjective, this may be more common in poetry than in prose. The aim is to recreate in the listener or reader the same sensations experienced by the speaker or the writer. In most descriptions, presumably, unless it is one of those very prosaic, matter-of-fact descriptions, such as we get in auctioneers' catalogues or in science textbooks, language is being employed for this purpose. The speaker wants to awaken in his listener the same experiences and sensations that the scene originally produced in himself. When Coleridge wrote his famous description of the ice floes in the Ancient Mariner, remember? Ice was here. Ice was there. The ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swoon. Or those equally famous lines on the same subject. Ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. He was not giving an objective description. He wanted to create in the reader the same feeling as he himself experienced when he imagined that sea of ice. The difficulty lies in the fact that no two readers will feel quite the same about it. And perhaps not one of them will feel precisely the same as Coleridge did. And this is only one of the difficulties where the use of language for the communication of the subjective is concerned. That resort should be had to figures of speech, and symbolism is inevitable. But again, the value of these must, to a considerable extent, vary within individuals and their experiences. These are the 4 chief purposes for which language is used. The last 3 from the first, in a certain amount of subjectivity, is involved. The first is purely objective. So, we may say there are 2 ways, as distinct from purposes, of using language. 1. Scientifically, and 2. Poetically. The words used simply to communicate a fact are used scientifically. They deal with the object without relating it to the world of values or personality. Words used for any of the other 3 purposes are used poetically, since they reflect, in one way or another, human personality and feeling. The character of a nation is reflected in its language, no less than in its songs, manners, and customs. So is the character or particular historical period. The English of the age of Milton is not that of the age of Steele and Addison, and both are different from that of the Victorian era. And this last is from the language of our days. There is something oratorical, magisterial, and majestic about the Latin language, with its long rolling periods, clinched by the verb at the end. The Greek abounds more in abstract terms, for the Greeks were the fathers of philosophy. The German tendency to exclude, as far as possible, all words of foreign derivation and to replace them by terms of native origin is as interesting as the opposite in English. The English language, as a matter of fact, mainly because of historical factors, use the most hybrid in the world. And it is fortunate that it is through our willingness to welcome rather than to exclude for influences. Our vocabulary has become enriched, and we have been enabled to make nice distinctions, in which are denied to most other languages. To take one example, the word king has 3 adjectives corresponding to it: royal, legal, and kingly. The first, of French origin, is the least expressive of the 3. It simply means pertaining to a king. Thus we speak of the royal coach, the royal signature, and so forth, without implying any particular qualities or characteristics. Regal, from the Latin root, suggests the pomp and glory of kingship. Kingly, of native origin, refers to those gracious qualities which we should expect to find in the ideal king. This is only one example of the way in which language has benefited by its willingness to absorb words of foreign derivation. Now, if it is clear and accurate thinking is of such importance as we have made out earlier, hardly less important is the cultivation of the ability to express oneself in words. For in the first place, such an ability is a definite assistance to clear and concise thought. And secondly, it is absolutely indispensable if we are to communicate the results of our thinking to others. There are 3 essentials of good style: clarity, precision, and euphony. How to attain these cannot be taught by any textbook. It is largely a matter of practice and feeling. And a great deal can also be done by a continual reading of such authors as Stevenson and Lamb, and there are many more, who noted as good stylists without being eccentric. There are nevertheless certain general considerations which can be dealt with here, as well as certain common faults against which the student can be warned. And it is on those lines that we now propose to proceed. What about precision? Question mark. The first essential of good style is precision. However, a vocabulary we have, however smoothly our periods flow, however moving or impressive our writing may be, all these things count for naught if we fail to say precisely what we mean. This would appear self-evident, yet it is surprising how many people fall short in this respect. Anyone who has had to do with the correction of essays or any other form of written work must frequently, on pointing out an error or absurdity in some statement have been met with the reply, "But I did not mean it to be taken in that way. What I meant was..." Nor is this lack of precision confined to the comparatively young and inexperienced. How often do we hear politicians, public speakers, or writers in newspapers complain that they have been misunderstood, or that an entirely false construction has been placed upon their words? In some cases, admittedly, the false construction is deliberate, but more often it is the fault of the speaker or writer himself, who thinks he has said one thing when actually he has said something quite different. And the result, of course, is endless confusion and often a great deal of fruitless argument. The first thing that is necessary for an author or the writer then is to know exactly what he wishes to say. The second is to say it exactly. One is just as important as the other, as we put it. The primary rule and condition of good and effective writing is not to attempt to express ourselves in language before we thoroughly know our own meaning. When a man perfectly understands himself, appropriate diction will generally be at his command. In the next place, preciseness in the use of terms is required. Other well-known writers have given similar advice. No precision hinges upon the smallest unit we use in linguistic expression, the word. Every word in a sentence has a value of its own and plays its part in giving meaning to the sentence as a whole. One single word, and more often than not, the meaning of the sentence is changed, only in a slight or subtle way, perhaps, but changed for all that. Here is a sentence taken from an article which appeared in one of the newspapers once upon a time. When was evacuation has started, the children will be in charge of their teachers. What was meant was in the change, or rather in the charge of the teachers. Note the difference in meaning affected by this one small word. Or here is a similar instance from a broadcast news bulletin. The handbooks will be in possession of the territorials by the end of the month. Again, the omission of the simple word "the" has entirely changed the meaning of the sentence. These are two examples showing how necessary it is that we should consider every word we write or even speak and make sure that it really expresses what we intended. At first sight, this may seem quite an easy matter, but in practice it is not so simple. It demands a wide vocabulary and appreciation of the nice distinctions between words which are commonly regarded as synonyms, and a care and discrimination in the use of language. In the long run, only practice, real conscientious practice, can make perfect. But 5 useful pieces of advice may be given here, which, if followed out, should at least make for precision in writing and utterance. 1. Make sure you use the right word. One that is near enough will not do to describe a person as a great talker, is to give him an entirely different character that's suggested by the phrase, a great speaker. The big men of the day are not the same as the great men of the day. In either of these instances, a totally wrong impression would be produced by an unthinking use of the wrong word. 2. Be very guarded in your use of colored terms. As we have seen before, many of the words and phrases are employed in expressing ourselves in speech or in writing, indicate not only facts, but also our attitude towards those facts. Our own conducts, campaign, our opponents indulge in tactics. When we approve our stand, a person takes, as we describe it, as firm. When we disapprove, we call it uncompromising or intransigent. I think that's the right word. To speak of a bold step implies admiration, but replace bold with the adjective rash, and purport of the statement is altered. A contributor to the Manchester Guardian gave a lengthy list of colored terms of this kind once upon a time, showing how prevalent they are in journalism and even in daily speech. And the moral? Well, be careful. The terms you employ do not give a wrong impression of your attitude. 3. Avoid hackneyed terms that have been given so wide a range of meaning that for all practical purposes they have no meaning at all, e.g. awful, and so forth. There is no need to extend the list. Popular usage has given 2 words like those such a variety of meanings that it is not always easy to determine in any particular context what precisely they do mean. Avoid them. Caution, of course, does not imply to their correct use, but first make sure that they are used correctly. 4. Be especially careful in your use of words that are habitually misused and misunderstood, e.g. mutual, aggravate, and so forth. This is closely related to point 3 we have spoken before. If ever you are in doubt about the correct meaning of any word or phrase, or are not sure whether you are using it correctly, well, you may consult some authority. You will find some listed at the end of one of the programs. I will let you know. 5. Avoid slang, colloquialisms, dialect, and so-called Americanisms. Slang is almost always lacking in precision. However, forceful and expressive, some of it may seem, and the same may be said or large part of the colloquial language. Dialect and so-called Americanisms may be quite clear to the writer and have a very definite meaning for him, but yet be quiet, unintelligible to the reader. There is nothing to be said against either, or the American language as such, although a great deal of the American that has gained currency in anywhere around the world, like England or even Australia, through the films and cheap magazines is not standard American at all, but American slang. And they are used to be depreciated so far as they tend to obscure and confuse meaning, and so to make for the opposite of the precise expression. Of course, when they are employed in dialogue, for the sake of local color, it is a different matter. These, then, are 5 points to bear in mind. And now, since practical experience in the using or user's words is the surest way to attend to precision in the art of writing and expression, we can proceed to some exercises if you like. We'll do that next time. That might be perhaps the wisest thing to do. But for now, I'd like to make a little pause here and thank you for sharing this experience, and we shall meet again by the next episode. Until then, keep smiling and be happy. Thank you.